The air in Britain had grown thick with the sound of distant bombings and the heavy toll of grief. It was a time when no family could escape the looming presence of loss, a period when life itself seemed fragile and fleeting. For those who lived through the turmoil of World War II, the very notion of safety had become an illusion. In the dark corners of every home, behind closed doors, there existed a quiet but undeniable sense of anticipation. Families lived in perpetual limbo, suspended between the hope that their loved ones might return and the fear that they never would. They had come to accept the unknown as part of their daily existence. The war, stretching its relentless grip over every corner of Europe, had affected every aspect of life. But for the families back home in Britain, it wasn't just the soldiers who suffered. It was the mothers, fathers, siblings, and children, all anxiously waiting for letters from the front lines, their hearts heavy with each passing day. These letters, often the only form of communication between them and their loved ones, were a source of both comfort and anxiety. Every word on paper was a lifeline, a thread that connected them to the world outside the chaos. But there were no guarantees in wartime, and sometimes those letters never came. The unspoken truth was that, for many families, the worst had already become a familiar reality. The war had taken their sons, husbands, brothers, and fathers, and there was little hope of them ever returning. Some families had already received the devastating news of their loss, and others were bracing for that same eventuality, knowing that the cruel nature of war made no exceptions. Outside, the relentless sound of air raids punctuated daily life. The ever-present fear of bombings meant that every moment could be a last. Sirens would blare, warning families of impending danger, and they would rush to shelters in a desperate bid to protect themselves from the devastation above. These bombings were not just an assault on the city's infrastructure, they were an assault on the very spirit of the people. Every time the ground shook from a distant explosion, it felt like the foundation of society itself was crumbling. Yet, in the face of this chaos, the people of Britain held on, their resilience an unspoken testament to their determination to survive. They had to keep going. The uncertainty of each day was a weight they learned to carry, like a heavy shroud that seemed to follow them everywhere they went. For the families living through this nightmare, the looming shadow of loss was something they could neither escape nor deny. Each evening, as night fell and the sounds of war echoed from afar, they would gather around their small dinner tables, sharing what little they had, trying to preserve some semblance of normality. But the normal they once knew had long since evaporated. The streets that were once filled with the sounds of children playing were now eerily quiet. The bustling marketplaces where neighbors would greet each other with a warm handshake had turned into places of hushed exchanges and fearful glances. The war had fundamentally altered the landscape of their lives, leaving in its wake a profound sense of displacement. Yet, even in the face of unimaginable grief, there was a sense of duty that permeated every home. They carried on not just for themselves, but for their country, for the belief that their sacrifices were part of a larger effort to bring an end to the darkness that had consumed Europe. The families who awaited their soldiers' return were living in a state of perpetual anxiety. They would go through their daily routines, but their minds were never far from the front lines. Every knock at the door could be the worst news imaginable. Every unfamiliar face in their neighborhood was a reminder that someone else's son or husband might never come home. The dread of receiving that dreaded telegram, the official notice that their loved one had perished, was a constant weight on their hearts. They had all heard the stories, how soldiers, once brave and full of life, could be taken in an instant by a bullet, a bomb, or the violence of war. The sheer randomness of it all, the knowledge that anyone could be taken at any time, made every moment of life feel fragile and uncertain. In this environment, families were often left to prepare for the inevitable. The parents who had raised their sons to be strong, to stand tall and proud, now found themselves confronting the cruel truth that those same sons might never return. They knew that the chance of receiving a telegram or hearing that their loved one had been injured or killed was a constant threat hanging over them. And yet, they couldn't allow themselves to be consumed by grief alone. For the sake of those still at home, the families had to keep going. They had to find some sense of purpose, even as the war stripped away their sense of security. And so, the mothers carried on with their household chores, doing everything they could to maintain some semblance of normalcy. The fathers, often working multiple jobs, pushed forward with their duties, even as they feared for the fate of their sons. And the children, too young to fully understand the scope of the war, clung to whatever sense of hope they could find in the world around them. The personal toll of the war was undeniable. But it wasn't just the loss of loved ones that hurt, it was the fear of what might be lost. The trauma was often quiet, an unseen wound that festered within the hearts of those left behind. The women who waited for their husbands to return were sometimes forced to face the possibility that they would never see them again. The mothers who sent their sons to war were haunted by the possibility that they would never hold them in their arms again. The children who said goodbye to their fathers knew, deep down, that the war might take them forever. The weight of these fears was impossible to quantify, and yet it was present in every family, in every home. But it was not just a time of fear and mourning. It was also a time of unimaginable strength. The families who braced for loss were not simply resigned to their fates. They were waiting for something, a letter, a phone call, a telegram, that might change everything. They were waiting for any sign that their loved ones were still alive, still fighting. The mere act of waiting was an act of defiance. It was a refusal to succumb to despair, even in the face of overwhelming odds. They held on to their loved ones in their hearts, clinging to the hope that they would return and that the war, like all wars before it, would eventually end. And so, in spite of the terror that surrounded them, they continued with their lives, finding moments of solace wherever they could. Life, for the families of Britain, had become a balancing act between the impossible hope of survival and the grim inevitability of death. Each day brought with it a new set of challenges: how to cope with the fear, how to manage the weight of uncertainty, how to find meaning in a world turned upside down by war. The emotional toll of waiting, of living with the constant fear of loss, was something that could never be fully articulated. It was a silent burden, born in the hearts of millions. And yet, despite it all, they carried on, holding on to the belief that their sacrifices, their resilience, would one day bring an end to the war. Theirs was a quiet kind of strength, an enduring, unspoken resolve that refused to give in to despair. They were the backbone of Britain, and they stood firm, bracing for the loss that they feared but refusing to let it define them. As the war raged on, Britain found itself at a crossroads. The casualty numbers were staggering, the toll on civilians was immeasurable, and the country's military forces were stretched thin. The leadership in London, made up of wartime strategists and seasoned commanders, began to feel the heavy weight of their decisions. The stakes had never been higher. It was not just the fate of a single battle or the survival of a single town at risk. The very soul of Britain, the heart of its people, was in peril. Each move, each decision, could tip the balance, and the consequences of failure were unimaginable. The question that now loomed in the minds of British commanders was whether it was time to escalate, to take the fight to the heart of the enemy, to strike hard and decisively. In the shadows of war, there was a sense of urgency that bordered on desperation. The military apparatus of Britain, once the envy of the world, was now dealing with limited resources, diminishing manpower, and an ever-growing list of wounded soldiers. Despite these challenges, the pressure to act was mounting. On the battlefield, the war was brutal and unforgiving. Germany's advances seemed unstoppable, and every delay or indecision on the part of Britain was interpreted as weakness by the enemy. For many, the idea of a calculated retaliation seemed not just necessary, but inevitable. The public, already fatigued by the constant air raids and the strain of wartime life, was demanding action. They wanted to see results, wanted to believe that their sacrifice, losing husbands, sons, brothers, was not in vain. It was during this critical time that the British military leadership began formulating a plan for a large-scale strike. The objective was clear: to dismantle the enemy's war machine, to cripple its infrastructure, and to send a message that Britain would no longer sit idly by as their cities were bombed and their soldiers died. The operation was designed to be swift, devastating, and, most importantly, conclusive. The planners knew that such an attack would likely incur heavy losses, both in terms of British personnel and in civilian lives, but the larger strategic objective was undeniable. This was a war, after all, and the costs of victory were never small. The proposed operation would see British forces infiltrating enemy-held territories, cutting through their defenses, and striking at the heart of their military and industrial hubs. The idea was that by attacking key locations, factories, supply depots, railways, they could disrupt the enemy's ability to wage war on the British mainland. It was a direct, no-nonsense approach designed to force the enemy to the negotiating table. And yet, as the plan took shape, there were murmurs of unease within the ranks. The further the plan developed, the more the leadership began to understand the full ramifications of the strike. While the potential to cripple the enemy's war effort was clear, so too was the possibility of inciting further escalation. The enemies Britain faced were not a distant, faceless foe. They were people, too. They had families. And the attack would undoubtedly affect countless civilians caught in the crossfire. The question of morality began to weigh heavily on the minds of Britain's commanders. In times of war, difficult choices had to be made, but there was a growing sense of unease. Was it right to sacrifice innocent lives for the greater good of the nation? Was it justifiable to carry out a strike that would not only harm the enemy but also wreak havoc on their own civilians? The more the commanders deliberated, the more the gravity of the decision settled in. They were not just deciding on military tactics, they were deciding on the kind of nation Britain wanted to be after the war, the kind of legacy they wanted to leave for future generations. They were facing a moral reckoning that few had anticipated when the war first began. This internal conflict reached its peak in the final stages of preparation. The operation was nearly ready to be launched. Plans had been drawn up. Troops had been mobilized. Supplies were being assembled. The outcome of this battle, the success or failure of the mission, would shape the course of the war. And yet, something began to shift. Amidst the frenzy of planning, there was a moment of clarity, a realization that echoed through the ranks. British leadership understood that what made their country unique, what had set them apart throughout history, was not just their ability to fight and to endure. It was their restraint, their humanity, their sense of fairness even in the face of overwhelming odds. They had faced atrocities at the hands of their enemies, yet they still held on to the belief that they would not, under any circumstances, become like the very forces they were fighting against. It was this realization that led to the most unexpected of decisions, the abandonment of the proposed strike. For the first time in the course of the war, the British commanders chose to demonstrate restraint, to pull back from the brink of escalation. This wasn't a decision made from fear or weakness. It was made from a deep sense of conviction. The British leadership chose, in that moment, to refuse to become what they feared most, to resist the urge to retaliate in kind. They rejected the path of further violence and sought instead to maintain their moral standing. The war had already taken so much from them, and now, they were faced with a question of identity. Would they succumb to the brutalizing effects of war and lose the very principles they fought to protect, or would they maintain their integrity, even at great personal cost? This decision was not met with unanimous support. There were those within the ranks who felt that the attack was the only logical step. They saw it as an opportunity to strike back at an enemy who had shown no mercy, who had bombed British cities with abandon. But the leadership, determined to set a higher standard, pushed ahead with their decision to abandon the strike. The news rippled through the ranks, and the families of soldiers, those who had already sacrificed so much, were left to grapple with the implications of this change. To many, it was incomprehensible. How could Britain, on the verge of a strategic victory, hold back when the enemy showed no such restraint? Yet, for all the confusion and anger that followed, there was also a sense of something deeply profound taking place. The decision not to strike was not just a military maneuver. It was a statement, a declaration that even in the midst of war, some lines should never be crossed. The British leadership was telling the world that they would not sacrifice their values for expediency, and that some things were worth fighting for even beyond victory itself. This decision, while fraught with risks, would reverberate far beyond the military ranks. It would send a message to their own people and to the enemy. Britain would never stoop to the level of those who waged war without conscience. As the news of the abandonment spread, it was met with mixed reactions. Some saw it as a noble act, a refusal to be tainted by the very forces they sought to defeat. Others, however, viewed it as a missed opportunity, an act of cowardice in the face of the enemy. But the moral clarity of the decision could not be denied. It was an act of great courage, one that required a strength of character that transcended the military and political calculations of the time. For the first time in a long while, Britain had acted with respect, with dignity. They had shown the world that even in the darkest of hours, the light of moral integrity could still shine through. The impact of this decision, though not immediately apparent, would be felt across the war in the years to come. The refusal to escalate, the restraint shown by Britain in its darkest moment, would later become a defining characteristic of its wartime narrative. It would be a story told not of military dominance or sheer force of will, but of the quiet strength that comes from holding on to one's principles in the face of overwhelming adversity. And in the years following the war, when the dust finally began to settle and the world looked back on the events that had shaped the course of history, the legacy of that decision, of British restraint in the face of devastating provocation, would stand as one of the most important chapters of all. In the shadow of impending action, as the war's ferocity pushed Britain to the brink, an extraordinary shift occurred within the hearts and minds of its leadership. The strain of months, even years, of bloodshed had taken its toll not only on the soldiers who fought at the front lines but also on the commanders who were tasked with making life-and-death decisions that would shape the future of their nation. What had once seemed like a clear, unavoidable path towards retaliation suddenly began to feel like a treacherous road, one fraught with moral peril and a cost that would be far greater than the immediate gains it promised. As military leaders and advisors convened to finalize plans for the attack, a wave of doubt began to ripple through the ranks, sparking an internal struggle that few had anticipated. In a world defined by ruthless pragmatism, where victory was the sole measure of success, a new, almost unthinkable idea began to take hold: restraint. The first signs of hesitation came in private conversations, whispered doubts among commanders, and quiet discussions held behind closed doors. The very idea of holding back when the opportunity to strike was so ripe, when victory seemed within reach, was a revolutionary thought. But as the plans for the strike were laid out with meticulous precision, the weight of the decision started to become more apparent. Britain had fought tirelessly for years, enduring bombings, losing soldiers, and suffering unspeakable grief. The urge for vengeance had grown almost instinctual. After all, how could the British people allow themselves to be humiliated further? How could they sit idly by while their cities were razed to the ground, their families torn apart by the violence that spread across the continent? The frustration, the anger, the desire for retribution, it all built up to a fever pitch. And yet, despite these emotions, a growing realization began to emerge. They could not become the very monsters they were fighting against. It was in the darkest moments of contemplation that the British leadership found themselves confronting the true cost of war, not in terms of numbers, strategy, or territory gained, but in terms of the human cost. It was not just the soldiers at the front who were affected by the brutality of the conflict, but the civilians who had already paid a terrible price. The bombings that had flattened entire neighborhoods, the lives lost in air raids, the families left to pick up the pieces of a broken world, it had all taken a devastating toll on the British psyche. And now, as Britain stood on the precipice of further violence, the military brass was faced with a difficult question: would more bloodshed truly make a difference, or would it simply perpetuate a never-ending cycle of destruction? As the days passed and the military leadership wrestled with their conscience, the solution began to crystallize, slowly at first, like a flicker of light in an otherwise impenetrable darkness. The decision to call off the attack, to abandon the strike that had been so carefully planned and so eagerly anticipated, was made not from fear, but from a newfound clarity of purpose. It wasn't that they lacked the courage to fight; they had already shown more than enough courage. It wasn't that they didn't understand the stakes. But what they had come to realize, almost as if by instinct, was that there was something even more important than victory in this war: the preservation of humanity itself. The very thing that had driven Britain to wage this war, to defend its shores and its values, was at risk of being lost in the pursuit of victory. In the quiet moments of reflection, the leadership came to understand that the morality of their actions would define them long after the war had ended. They knew that if they chose to strike, If they chose to continue the cycle of violence, they would not only be perpetuating the destruction of their enemies but also losing something far more precious, their own integrity. In the course of a few fateful days, the commanders chose restraint over revenge, empathy over vengeance. The decision wasn't made lightly. It was made after careful thought, weighing the possible outcomes and the long-term consequences of their actions. They knew that by walking away from the opportunity to strike, they would be taking a tremendous risk. Their enemies would see it as weakness, perhaps even as an invitation to escalate the war. Some of the British public, too, would feel betrayed, unable to comprehend the decision to abandon what seemed like the perfect chance to deal a decisive blow. Yet, even as the doubts and fears began to swirl, there was an undeniable sense of something profound taking place. The British leadership, in choosing restraint, was rejecting the conventional wisdom of warfare, which had long emphasized the need to destroy, to annihilate, to claim victory at any cost. They were choosing a path that was not driven by immediate gain but by a deeper understanding of the human experience. It was not about winning a battle. It was about protecting the dignity of their people and the lives of innocent civilians who would undoubtedly suffer in the wake of an all-out strike. And, perhaps most importantly, it was about ensuring that, in the end, Britain would remain the nation it had always been, a beacon of hope, of justice, and of the moral compass that had guided its history. In a world where the lines between good and evil often became blurred, where the horrors of war threatened to consume everything in its path, the British decision to show restraint was a profound and radical act. It was not a rejection of the war effort itself, nor was it a denial of the immense suffering the British people had endured. It was a refusal to allow the violence of the world to dictate their actions. And as the decision was communicated to the military, to the commanders in the field, and eventually to the people of Britain, a strange sense of relief began to replace the tension that had gripped the nation for so long. There was a quiet pride in the knowledge that, in the face of overwhelming pressure, Britain had chosen not to become what it most feared. But even as the decision was made, the ramifications of that choice were not immediately clear. The public's reaction was mixed, as expected. Some hailed the decision as a bold move, a testament to the strength of Britain's character. They understood that, in the long run, the cost of unchecked violence would be far greater than the short-term satisfaction of retribution. Others, however, were less convinced. The war was a brutal, unforgiving conflict, and to back away from a chance for victory felt like a betrayal. The families who had already lost so much, the soldiers who had fought and died for their country, could not easily reconcile the idea that their suffering had led to a decision that might not bring immediate results. There was a sense of disappointment in the air, a feeling of confusion among those who had sacrificed so much in the name of justice and victory. But as the weeks passed and the dust settled, the true significance of the decision began to reveal itself. It became clear that Britain's refusal to strike had not been a sign of weakness, but rather a sign of incredible strength. In a world where revenge and destruction were often viewed as the only paths to victory, Britain had chosen a different route, one that emphasized compassion, one that rejected the temptation to perpetuate the cycle of violence. And, in doing so, Britain had begun to shift the very nature of the war itself. No longer was the battle solely about military dominance or territorial control. It had become about something far more significant: the preservation of what it meant to be human, to be just, and to be moral, even in the midst of a world consumed by chaos. The decision to abandon the strike, to refuse to follow the path of violence, marked a turning point not only for Britain but for the entire world. It set a precedent, a model for how nations could conduct themselves with dignity and restraint even in the darkest of times. The action, or lack thereof, became a beacon of hope in a war that seemed to have no end. It showed the world that, despite the brutality and carnage of war, there was still room for compassion, for respect, and for the belief that humanity could emerge from even the most devastating of conflicts with its soul intact. As the war continued, the significance of this decision grew clearer. It became a symbol of Britain's strength, of its unwavering commitment to its values, and of its determination to never lose sight of what truly mattered. In the long run, it was not the battles won or the territories reclaimed that would define Britain's place in history, but rather the courage to make the right choice when it mattered most. and that courage, embodied in a single act of restraint, would resonate far beyond the scope of the war itself, shaping the future of the nation and the world in ways that no one could have predicted. The decision to call off the planned strike sent ripples through the British military and government, but its true impact began to unfold on the streets of Britain, in the hearts of its people, and within the very fabric of the nation's spirit. The news of the change in military strategy spread like wildfire, reaching families who had been anxiously awaiting any sign of progress or victory. The country, long accustomed to a war effort defined by sacrifice and bloodshed, was suddenly confronted with an unexpected turn of events. For many, the refusal to strike felt like a betrayal, an abandonment of the hard-fought resolve that had kept them going throughout the darkest days of the conflict. The very idea that their military leadership had chosen restraint instead of retribution was difficult to comprehend for those who had already suffered so much. How could they have passed up such a pivotal opportunity, one that promised to weaken the enemy and perhaps even shorten the war? In the homes of the families who had already lost sons, fathers, and brothers, there was a deep and immediate sense of confusion. The fathers who had sent their children off to war, hoping that the sacrifice would ultimately result in a better future, now felt that their efforts were being undermined. The mothers, who had lived in the daily fear of receiving the dreaded telegram or hearing the sound of a knock on the door signaling the loss of their loved ones, were left questioning the very purpose of all the suffering they had endured. The reality of war had already torn through their lives, and they were now left to grapple with the idea that, despite all they had sacrificed, Britain had chosen to show mercy to their enemies. The question they faced was simple but profound. Why not strike now when the opportunity was so clear? At first, the response from the public was mixed, clouded by emotions ranging from anger to disbelief. Many could not see the strategic wisdom in showing restraint. To them, it seemed like a missed chance for redemption, a chance to make their enemies feel the same pain and loss they had endured. For the families who had lost loved ones in bombings, the idea of pulling back when they had come so close to exacting justice felt incomprehensible. How could they understand the decision when it was rooted in ideals they had not yet embraced? For them, the war had always been about a fight for survival, a struggle to protect their way of life and to defeat those who had waged such unimaginable cruelty upon them. To hear that the British military would choose to show mercy, especially when the bombings and death had been so unrelenting, was a hard pill to swallow. But as the days passed and the decision to abandon the strike settled in, a deeper, more nuanced understanding began to emerge. The first stirrings of this shift came in the form of quiet conversations, first within families and then across communities. People began to realize that the decision was not about weakness, but about something far more difficult: strength. To hold back in the face of overwhelming temptation to strike out, to refuse to be governed by the same vengeful impulses that fueled the enemy, was a form of moral fortitude that was difficult to reconcile in the midst of a brutal war. But it was, undeniably, an act of courage. The leadership in Britain had chosen a path of integrity, a refusal to stoop to the level of the very forces they were fighting. In doing so, they had rejected the cycle of violence and retaliation that had defined the conflict for so long. As the weeks passed and the dust settled from the initial shock, the significance of the decision began to resonate more deeply with the British people. They began to see it not as a moment of weakness but as a turning point in the war. The British leadership had not only refused to perpetuate the cycle of violence, they had demonstrated that there was something greater than military victory, something that transcended the immediate stakes of war. They had shown that the values of humanity, decency, and respect for life were worth fighting for, even in the darkest of times. Slowly, the narrative of the war began to shift. It was no longer just about military victories and territorial conquests. It was also about the moral choices made along the way. The decision to hold back, to resist the temptation of retribution, had planted a seed of hope in the hearts of those who had long suffered under the weight of war's brutality. The public's reaction, though initially mixed, began to turn toward understanding. In communities across Britain, families who had borne the weight of personal loss began to reconsider their perspectives. They had been prepared for more grief, more devastation, but what they received instead was a chance, a glimmer of hope that perhaps the war did not have to continue along the same destructive path. As news of the decision to abandon the strike spread, people began to look at their leaders in a new light. The moral courage it took to make such a difficult decision, to forego immediate military advantage in favor of something greater, began to shine through. It was a leadership that sought to rise above the temptation of retaliation, to reject the bloodlust that so often defined wartime decisions. It was a rare, almost unheard of act in the context of World War II, a war that had been defined by swift, violent strikes, and where the calculus of war was almost always focused on winning at all costs. Now, for the first time in a long while, the British people saw a different kind of leadership, one that sought not just victory, but integrity. Yet, for all the respect that began to grow for the decision, there remained an undercurrent of uncertainty. The families who had borne the brunt of the war's brutality still harbored a deep wound. Their lives had been upended, their loved ones lost, and they could not easily let go of the desire for revenge. The possibility that their sacrifices might not have been met with the kind of retaliation they had hoped for was difficult to come to terms with. The emotional weight of loss is not something that can be easily erased, and even with the clarity that came with time, the pain of what had been endured could not be dismissed. For many, the idea that their loved ones had died without some form of justice seemed unjust. But for the leadership in Britain, the moral clarity of their decision was undeniable. They understood that the world they were fighting to protect, one that valued humanity and decency, could not be built on a foundation of vengeance. The temptation to strike had been strong, but so too had been the belief that Britain could be something more than just another warring nation. This decision was a reaffirmation of the values that had made Britain a beacon of hope in a world filled with darkness. It wasn't just about military strategy or defeating the enemy, it was about preserving the integrity of the nation, ensuring that, in the aftermath of the war, Britain would not lose itself to the same forces of hatred and violence that had fueled the conflict in the first place. As the years passed, the initial shock of the decision began to fade, and its true significance became more apparent. The British people began to see the wisdom in their leadership's restraint. While the war continued to drag on, and the suffering of countless families did not abate, the decision to avoid further escalation had ultimately served to preserve Britain's moral standing. In the face of a world filled with destruction, Britain had refused to let itself be consumed by the darkness of vengeance. It had chosen to remain a beacon of light, a symbol of the belief that, even in the darkest of times, there could be a higher path to follow. In the years following the war, as Britain began to rebuild and reflect on its role in the global order, the decision to hold back from further violence would come to be seen as one of the defining moments of the conflict. It became a symbol of Britain's strength, its unwavering commitment to its values, and its refusal to let the brutality of war change who they were as a nation. The families who had lost so much, though they would never forget the pain, began to understand that the moral choices made by their leaders had, in the end, safeguarded the very ideals that had been worth fighting for. And as history looked back on the war, it became clear that the refusal to strike, the decision to show restraint when all seemed lost, had changed the course of the nation's future in ways that were both profound and lasting. Britain had emerged from the war not just as a victor, but as a nation that had preserved its soul, even in the face of overwhelming darkness. The decision made by the British leadership to abstain from a devastating strike, to resist the temptation to escalate the violence in the heat of war, rippled far beyond the immediate impact it had within Britain's own borders. Its consequences were felt throughout the occupied territories, the enemy forces, and, perhaps most strikingly, within the very psyche of the aggressors themselves. The military planners had expected their decision to be perceived as a tactical retreat, a missed opportunity to cripple the enemy and shift the momentum of the war in Britain's favor. But what they failed to fully grasp was the profound impact this choice would have on the morale of their adversaries. It wasn't just a strategic move in a chess game of war, it was a statement, one that would reverberate across the enemy's ranks in ways they could neither predict nor control. In the occupied territories, where the enemy had established a stranglehold on the civilian population, the British decision to show restraint was, initially, a complete mystery. For years, they had been subjected to the cruelty and oppression of an occupying force that seemed unyielding, indifferent to the suffering of the people it had conquered. The air was thick with fear, with whispers of rebellion and resistance movements that could barely hold their ground against the overwhelming might of the invaders. The people, beaten down by years of occupation, could scarcely believe that the British, whom they saw as their hope for liberation, had chosen to forego the opportunity to strike. To them, this wasn't just about a military decision, it was a blow to their expectations of what Britain represented. Their liberation, their chance at freedom, had always been framed in the context of military action, of a powerful, decisive blow that would rid them of their tormentors once and for all.